Frank has undergone one of the craziest transformations of any brawlers in this past year. He has gone from a noob stomper whose stats on paper seemed undebeatable, yet in game was constantly horrible, to one of the strongest brawlers in the game, being able to be a solid pick even at high skill levels. Now, let's continue the most worrying trend in this channel, asking for your support. As always, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Only 15% of you are subscribed, so try and get that number up. Watch the full video if you're interested in the topic, and enjoy. First off, let's talk about Frank's basics and his main attack. As we all know too well, Frank has the most HP in the game and really embodies his tank class classification. He also has the tank trait, allowing him to gain supercharge from taking damage. His main attack sees him attack enemies with his hammer, sending a shockwave dealing 2480 damage at max level. This attack has a range of 6 tiles and can pierce through multiple enemies. This is all pretty basic, but where the nuance comes in is with his attack delay. Before each attack, Frank has an attack delay of 1.3 seconds, which is quite large, and during that time, if a form of crowd control is used on him, which is basically stuns or knockbacks, the attack gets cancelled. However, this was changed in a recent buff to Frank, but we'll touch on that later. Frank's main attack isn't really his main feature, as you can see by his stats. It deals quite mediocre damage and has a mediocre range. His attack being able to pierce enemies is one of its main features, making Frank a solid pick against brawlers with spawnables and also good at crowd control, especially with his super and his hypercharge, but that's a topic for later. The main feature of intrigue in his main attack is his attack delay. This is Frank's biggest crutch, as it prevents him from being able to unload shots quickly and lets opponents whittle down his health. Furthermore, it gives him a big weakness to brawlers like Shelly or El Primo, who can use knockback to stop Frank from attacking, and with Frank's big health, they can chain supers to the point that they can kill Frank. Now let's talk about Frank's super. Frank's super sees him do a similar attack to his main attack, but this time the range is 7 tiles and not 6, and it stuns any enemies that are caught in the attack, as well as breaking all walls in the path. Basically, Frank's super is an upgraded version of his main attack. It has the same attack pattern, the same attack delay, but it gives a boost in range and the added ability of a stun. The super also continues Frank's theme of crowd control, with his piercing attack, large attack width, and now, the stun. Like with El Primo, Frank can be used to break open the map, but it is rather counterintuitive, as they both thrive with the wall staying up rather than being broken. With what I've said so far, Frank's role is quite clear. He's someone that can tank shots and be used to control areas or move the map, being able to clear multiple enemies while having obvious weaknesses to brawlers with crowd control abilities of their own that can disrupt Frank's attack and super. Despite having defined strengths and weaknesses, Frank was far from balanced, and fell into a similar category to that of brawlers like Colt, Jesse, and Edgar, a noob stomper that destroyed new players but wasn't good enough to compete at high level. But why? Firstly, and most obviously, is his large health. He has so much health that it can often seem intimidating to face off against for new players, and if the Frank is even semi-good at dodging, it may require all players to defeat a singular Frank, allowing the Frank's teammates to gain control of the game. Just like why Jesse is a noob stomper, Frank's ability to hit multiple enemies and stun them as well makes him effective noob stomper. As I've mentioned before, noobs are more likely to disrespect laning and group up, making them free to get slaughtered by Frank and his stun. And that ties into my final point about why Frank is a noob stomper, his stun. Brawlers with a stun ability are inherently noob stomping. Players at a higher skill level know how to play around brawlers with the ability to stun. For example, if they see a Frank with a super, they know to stay away, or at least be ready with a knockback the moment the Frank starts his super animation. Another example is Dynamite, who destroys players at lower ranges with his stuns, but many pros and players at higher levels rarely get stunned unless the Dynamite goes bush camping, being able to recognize the threat it poses and position or dodge based on that. Anyway, you get the point. Most stun abilities are much more effective at lower skill levels than at higher skill levels, and the same ring true with Frank. I've talked a lot about how Frank is good, so why was he consistently such a bad brawler for most of his lifetime? It's simple. His main strength was also his main weakness, his tankiness. Yes, sometimes being tanky is always a good thing, especially in a game like Brawl Stars, where each shot hit goes to an inherently powerful ability, the super. This allows enemies to be able to continually hit shots on Frank, and even if Frank survives, he has fed the enemies their supers, which is especially deadly when facing someone like Clancy, Terra, or Surge, who has a powerful super and even in some cases a hypercharge. This is often why Franks don't usually have horrible KD ratios. Even when you think they have played the worst on their team, they often survive the brutal attacks from the enemy with their high health, but they also feed the enemy, making the enemy kill you more easily as a result. To add to this, Frank is one of the easiest brawlers to consistently hit, due to his gigantic hitbox. This further adds to the feeding off him that the enemy does, and once again is another nerf by Supercell to him to balance his inherently broken stats. That is nothing compared to his biggest crutch, his attack delay. This attack delay basically allows for Frank to be out DPS'd by many brawlers, even at short range, where Frank theoretically is supposed to be good at. As I've mentioned before, this also gives Frank a big weakness to brawlers with crowd control abilities, as they are able to cancel out his attack and his super if timed correctly. However, there's also a third weakness to his attack delay, brawlers with fast movement and movement abilities. Brawlers with fast movement speeds are able to take advantage of Frank's attack delay and unload shots on Frank, and once Frank charges up his shot, they can move out of his range. Brawlers like Claro and Leon can easily destroy a Frank if they time their shots well and make sure to move well. Brawlers like Mortis and Stu can also bully the Frank with their movement, being able to dash in and dash out, causing much annoyance to the Frank, and being able to constantly get their supers back, with the nature of Frank's easiness to hit and his easiness to feed off of. All this talk about movement, hitboxes, and tankiness, and attack delay is all well and good, but there's one final infinity stone to go into Frank's inability to be good: damage inflation. I've talked about this at length before, but for a quick summary, damage inflation is basically the increase in damage over time, as damage was much lower in the old days, but now much brawlers deal so much more damage. So how does this relate to Frank? Let's think about it. Frank is obviously the most tankiest brawler in the game, but he can't really deal too much damage, especially with his attack delay. With the damage inflation that has been going on, you can see why this lack of a solid damage output can hurt Frank. Even with his high health, the enemies are no longer as unable to kill him as before, as they now have more tools to bring down his health more effectively. In the older days, Frank could at least tank for his teammates and stay alive for a reasonably long amount of time, fulfilling his role. Now, however, just pop a hypercharge, or even a super in the case of someone like Clancy, and the Frank will be erased in a few seconds. In fact, the very point of a tank is becoming in danger with the ever-increasing damage, as it's no longer as much of a balance between brawlers who are damage dealers and those who are tanky brawlers. Now, the scale is more like who can deal the most damage as quickly as possible, which is also a perfect metaphor for heist, but I'll cover that in a later video. With all of these issues, there was no wonder that Frank was such a terrible brawler for so long, like so many other tanks. So what did BrawlStars do to fix this? Two things: a small tweak to his attack, and the addition of a small purple button to him. Let's first talk about this tweak to the attack. Frank got a rework to his main attack that made it so that the more damage Frank took, the faster his reload speed would get. And this rework made Frank go from the worst to the best brawler in the game. Frank's attack delay used to be one of his biggest crutches, but now, with the more damage he took, he could attack much faster and unload many shots. And this was a great change for him. First of all, it took away his major weakness to CC brawlers. Yes, he still has a weakness to them, but this allows him to at least have a chance to get the kill on them before they use their ability. Secondly, it allowed them to have an incentive for tanking shots. Before, the only incentive for tanking shots was moving up the map and slowly charging super. Now, you could intentionally tank some shots with Frank and use it to your advantage, being able to kill the enemy much faster with his fast unload speed, giving him a good use to Frank's gigantic HP. The third and final reason this was a good change for Frank is that it allowed Frank to compete with damage inflation. In a perfect world, damage inflation wouldn't exist, and Frank shouldn't have to get a boost to his unload speed in order to compete with brawlers. But we aren't living in a perfect world, so we must adapt to it. And this is why the change is good. It fights fire with fire. Yes, many brawlers who would face him can still deal immense damage to him, but Frank can now tank those shots and be even stronger as a result, allowing him to out DPS brawlers he previously couldn't have dreamed of doing that to. Sure, it contributes to damage inflation, but at this point, it's too late to stop that train, and this change helps Frank keep up with the other inflated brawlers. Not only did he compete, but he thrived. Not even thrived actually, he was the best brawler in the game, especially with the release of the hypercharge alongside of his rework. Frank's hypercharge is Seismic Smash, which allows him to hit every enemy and destroy all environment in a radius around him. The hypercharge allowed Frank to not be limited by the radius of his regular super attack, and let him destroy and stun everything in the hypercharge's radius, adding to his crowd control ability. However, this could be counterintuitive, as Frank often relies on walls in his gameplay, and this hypercharge is probably the best way to get rid of a lot of walls, so you can see why that could be bad for Frank. With a very solid hypercharge, and a rework that basically removed many of his former weaknesses, it is no wonder that Frank became the best brawler in the game. Adding one or the other may have made him less powerful and even considered balanced, but adding both at once was definitely overkill for Frank, and skyrocketed him to the top of the meta. You can't just add 2 broken abilities to a brawler and expect him to remain balanced, or even 1, in the case of my favorite brawler Daryl. However, Supercell managed to remedy the issue with several nerfs to his health, his unlockables, and other things that all worked together to bring down Frank. But did it work? I would say yes. He isn't as stupidly broken as right after the rework, but neither is he as stupidly trash as he was before the rework. He remains in a good spot, as arguably the best tank, but not completely unable to be countered. However, he is still good enough to fight a higher ladder, and we even saw him get picked multiple times in World Finals, though I can also say the same thing for Kit, unfortunately. Overall, Frank has one of the most interesting timelines of all the brawlers. He went from being a brawler with multitude of weaknesses that overwhelmed his seemingly good stats on paper, to a brawler that still had some weaknesses but now had the tools to fight against them, but also technically had worse stats than before. Pretty crazy, right? Anyway, thanks for watching. Watch this video, or this playlist, or join the Discord server.